The tension has been building for months, and now it has finally spilled into the ballot box. Canada, a nation that has long prided itself on its quiet diplomacy, its steady hand in international affairs, its carefully cultivated friendship with the United States, is heading to the polls. And the reason, more than any domestic scandal, more than any housing crisis or healthcare debate, is one man, one policy, and one relentless economic storm blowing in from the South. Donald Trump's trade war has forced Canada into an election it never quite expected to fight on these terms. To understand why this moment feels so seismic, you have to understand just how deeply the relationship between Canada and the United States runs. These are not merely neighbors. They share the longest undefended border in the world. They are each other's largest trading partners. Hundreds of billions of dollars flow across that border every single year. Cars, energy, lumber, aluminum, steel, agriculture. For generations, this relationship was so stable, so mutually beneficial, that most Canadians never thought twice about it. It was simply the water they swam in. Then came the tariffs. When the Trump administration began imposing sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, and eventually broader threats touching nearly every major export sector, it didn't just rattle financial markets. It rattled something deeper. It rattled Canadian identity because for many Canadians, especially those in manufacturing towns in Ontario, in the energy corridors of Alberta, in the lumber communities of British Columbia, this wasn't abstract economics. This was their livelihood, their mortgage, their family business that had survived for 2 or 3 generations. And suddenly, all of it felt precarious. The political shockwave was immediate. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, already weakened by years of domestic controversy, found himself in an almost impossible position. How do you respond to an ally who has turned adversarial? How do you protect your economy without triggering a full-scale trade collapse? Trudeau's government attempted retaliatory measures, matching tariffs with tariffs, targeting American goods in a carefully choreographed counter-response. But the pressure never let up. And then, in a moment that stunned even veteran political observers, Trudeau announced his resignation as Liberal Party leader, a development that might have dominated headlines under any other circumstances, but which quickly became folded into the larger story of a nation in economic and political upheaval. Into this volatile moment stepped Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, later the governor of the Bank of England, a man whose entire career had been defined by navigating financial crises. Carney took the Liberal leadership with a single dominant message. I know how economies work. I know how to protect yours. And in an era when Canada's economic sovereignty felt genuinely threatened, that message landed with unexpected force. On the other side, the Conservative Party under Pierre Poilievre had spent the better part of 2 years building what looked like an insurmountable political lead. Poilievre's populist energy, his sharp rhetorical attacks on Trudeau's cost of living failures, his outsider appeal, all of it had driven Conservative poll numbers to historic heights. An election, it had seemed, was his to lose. But the trade war changed the math. Because when Canadians began to feel genuinely threatened, not just frustrated, not just disappointed, but genuinely threatened by an aggressive foreign power, the question they started asking was no longer simply, who do I blame for high grocery prices? The question became, who do I trust to stand up for Canada? And that is a very different question with very different answers. Suddenly, the political conversation shifted from affordability to sovereignty. From kitchen tables to trade negotiation rooms, from domestic grievances to national identity, pollsters watched with fascination as Carney's numbers climbed. The Liberals, written off as political roadkill just months earlier, found themselves in a genuine contest. Because crisis, as history shows again and again, has a way of reshaping what voters want from their leaders. And all the while, Trump kept talking. He referred to Canada as a potential 51st state, a comment that, whether meant seriously or as provocation, ignited fury from coast to coast. It was the kind of remark that cuts through partisan lines, that makes a Conservative voter in rural Saskatchewan and a Liberal voter in downtown Toronto feel, for one brief moment, exactly the same thing: anger, pride, defiance. Canada's identity has always been partly defined by what it is not. And when an American president begins talking about absorbing Canada into the United States, something ancient and stubborn awakens in the Canadian national character. A quiet country becomes, in those moments, surprisingly loud. So this election, whenever the final ballots are counted, however the results ultimately shake out, is not a typical election. It is not a referendum on tax policy or transit spending or who manages the federal budget more efficiently. It is an election about something rarer and more fundamental. It is an election about what Canada is, who Canada belongs to, and how fiercely Canadians are willing to fight to protect it. The trade war didn't just force Canada to the polls. It forced Canada to look at itself, to ask hard questions about economic dependency, about foreign policy, about what kind of relationship it wants with its most powerful neighbor going forward. Those questions will outlast this election cycle. They will shape Canadian politics, Canadian trade strategy, and Canadian foreign policy for years, perhaps decades to come. But right now, in this moment, they are being asked at the ballot box, and the world is watching to see how Canada answers.